So for today, just focus on that. I'm going to write the path up here on the board, but I want you all to more be familiar with the picture, because when you're going to need to know it for the exam next Thursday. But it's better for you to learn the picture of the heart, the parts of the heart, the regions that the blood flows through, and then put the order together. So if you look at the heart, any idea of a difference between left and right side of the heart?
The left side is thicker. You have to have oxygen. What has to get from right?
So you said one side doesn't have oxygenated blood?
Oxygenated, it has to go through the lungs.
Good. Okay, so which side is that?
The right side.
Okay, y'all studied. What am I doing this for? Y'all already know what I'm about to go over, which is good. It's great. All right, so if blood starts, and again, blood is going to flow everywhere throughout the body. So we just arbitrarily picked the right atrium. On your quiz, you won't have a starting place of the right atrium. Okay, so you have to make sure you just learn from one location where blood goes to when it leaves there. Another common error is on the test, since I'm not starting at the right atrium. Notice you would start at the right atrium and end at the right atrium. But if I start at the aorta, you're going to end at the aorta. But some students end up putting right atrium twice because they're thinking of more than likely just memorizing the paper and knowing that there's two right atriums, or one at the top and one at the bottom. But you would not put two right atriums on your paper, right? Because what you're writing down is where blood is now and then the next place that it goes. So it wouldn't make sense because blood doesn't go from the right atrium back to the right atrium again. So make sure on the quiz you do not put the right atrium twice. None of them should be twice except for the start and finish. All right, so the blood starts in the right atrium. Okay, and on the picture, make sure you can see or identify every place that blood is going through as you proceed. So from the right atrium, that's the upper superior part of the heart, the superior chamber on the right side. And when blood fills that area and it contracts, the heart contracts, we'll talk about contraction. But when the right atrium contracts, blood is pushed out of the right atrium. And where does it go next? It goes through a tricuspid valve. And on to the other space just below it, called the what? Right ventricle. Right ventricle. Okay? So again, looking at the picture should make it a lot easier. So blood just passively falls down into the right ventricle from the right atrium, but it has to go through the valve. What's the significance of a valve? What is a valve?
It keeps it from infection.
So it's a sort of a flap, right? Or door. Sometimes I think of it if we're talking about a house and rooms. If there is a way to have a door in the, I guess there is a way to have a door on the floor. But a valve would be like, the tricuspid valve would be like a door between the upstairs room and the downstairs room. So if the right atrium's the upstairs room, in order for blood to get to the right ventricle, it has to go through the door, which is the tricuspid valve. Then where does it go? And then it goes through another valve. And this one's called pulmonary. Okay? And so again, that's like another doorway. And as blood flows through that valve, it enters what? What space? Another space. A pulmonary trunk. Okay? So the pulmonary trunk is a fairly large space, not as large as a chamber of the heart, but large with respect to the blood vessels that the blood will flow through next. So we have the pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk. The word P just keeps coming up. Pulmonary arteries. And the lungs. Okay. Finally, we stop saying pulmonary. And then another pulmonary. Okay, so help me out here. So we have said pulmonary how many times? 4 times. What does pulmonary mean to you? It has something to do with the lungs, right? So why would anything related to blood have anything at all to do with lungs? Something about oxygen. What about oxygen? What do the lungs have to do with oxygen? It turns
carbon dioxide into oxygen.
It doesn't turn one thing into another. Yeah, that's the word, exchange. I knew what y'all meant, but you can't say it like that. Okay, so oxygen and CO2 are exchanged. Where? Right. Lungs. So the lungs is where something called gas exchange occurs. Gas exchange occurs in the lungs. And what gas are we talking about? Actually, 2 gases, oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas. So gas exchange occurs in the lungs. But again, don't just memorize that, understand what it actually means. So we have these 2 organs, the lungs, and they have one purpose. That is all they do. Exchange oxygen for CO2. That's it. So that's the only purpose we have for our lungs. That's about all they do for us. So they must be pretty important. Why are they so important? So what is happening as this blood, so we're talking about blood that just came from the right side of the heart. So the right side of the heart, now we're looking at the job of the lungs. What about the heart? What's the job of the heart? That's about it. Pump blood. Okay. Why is that so important?
So the body can receive oxygen and glucose.
Thank you. It all goes back. I'm telling you. So all of it goes right back to that. So the heart has to pump the blood, otherwise the blood would just sit there. Right? So oxygen that's in the right atrium will stay in the right atrium. So the heart has to pump the blood to deliver oxygen to the tissues. But now what? So once we've delivered oxygen to the tissues, we're going to have to go get some more oxygen, right? So just think of it in those terms. The blood has delivered its oxygen. Now it has to go through a path to get more oxygen. So blood is going to be continuously circulated for this purpose. Now, so you all told me the purpose of the heart is to pump blood. But you should also think, okay, what is the purpose of the right side of the heart versus the left side? They both have the function of pumping blood, but one side has a slightly different function than the other. Did y'all come across that? So the purpose of the right side of the heart
Carbon dioxide and oxygen.
Yes. Okay? But just to make it simpler, I'll tell you what she said. She said to drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen. Okay? But, and that's correct, but the easiest way to remember is the right side of the heart has the job of sending blood to the lungs, right? So again, if the right side of the heart doesn't contract, blood stays in the right side of the heart, and that blood has CO2. It doesn't have oxygen. So that blood is trying to make it to the lungs to pick up oxygen so it can deliver oxygen. Okay? And it'll make sense when I finish this. So the job of the right side of the heart, it only has one job: to deliver blood to the lungs and back. And notice what part of the path we've just looked at. So from the right side of the heart, since the right side of the heart has that one job, to pump CO2-rich blood to the heart, to the lungs, to pick up oxygen, to dump off the CO2 and pick up the oxygen, and bring that new oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. You have it? So the right side of the heart has the job of sending blood to the lungs for gas exchange, which means getting rid of CO2, and picking up oxygen. And now when that blood leaves the lungs, it's what the gas is in the blood at that point? Oxygen rich. Okay? So at every point in the path, you all should also know if the blood is CO2 rich or oxygen rich. So all this blood is CO2 rich. How do we know? Because the only way we can change the content of the gas in the blood is at the lungs, and we haven't made it there yet. Okay? So the blood, the path of the blood is going to stay CO2 rich until we get to the lungs where the gas exchange occurs. So CO2 is dumped out, and O2 is brought into the bloodstream. Okay, make sure you all are getting this. So the lungs, you know, we inhale oxygen, and when we exhale, it's CO2, right? So the CO2 we get rid of because, and we'll get to the specifics when we get to the respiratory system. But just keep that in mind. The whole job of the right side of the heart is to deliver CO2-rich blood to the lungs and to pick up oxygen-rich blood and return that good oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. So where does blood go when it leaves the pulmonary vein? From the pulmonary vein, we're back at the heart. Okay? So if I'm a red blood cell in the right atrium, I have to make it all the way to the lungs, and we'll see that the red blood cells are what carry oxygen. So the red blood cell is trying to make it to the lungs to pick up the oxygen. And now that red blood cell is in the left atrium. Okay? And it's oxygen rich now. So in the right or the left atrium, the blood is oxygen rich. How do we know? Because blood just left the what? The lungs, where the blood picks up oxygen. Okay. Everybody getting that okay? Okay. So the left atrium. Now, would you say that red blood cell in the left atrium is happy because it has oxygen? Pretty much. But it also knows that it has a job to do. It doesn't just hold on to the oxygen. Its job is to what? Transport the oxygen to some body cell. Okay? So, what is its path? So that blood in the left atrium goes through another valve called the bicuspid valve. This one's also called mitral valve. So the bicuspid valve, and then it empties into the left ventricle. Okay, so what's the purpose of the bicuspid valve? What did you all say the purpose of a valve is?
To keep it from going back.
What you all just said. Yeah. Just said it a different way, but all of you are correct. So the bicuspid valve, or all valves, prevent the backflow of blood, prevent blood from going backwards. So the path has to continue forward in order to work properly. So the bicuspid valve, on the test I may ask you, what's the function of the bicuspid valve? This would obviously be on the Chapter 19 test, though. That's about the heart. So the bicuspid valve prevents blood from going back into the left atrium. Okay? It prevents the blood that's in the left ventricle from flowing back into the left atrium. So at some point you'll need to know the purpose of each individual valve. All right, so from the left ventricle, where do we go next? Now, wait a minute, I may as well stop there. So up here on the board, you see just above, you have the right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle. That's the right side of the heart. Find the left side in your picture, on your picture. Left atrium, bicuspid valve, and left ventricle. So on the picture it's number 6, 7, and 8. So, no, not 6. Where are we? 7 and 8. Okay. So the atrium isn't labeled. So the left atrium, well, it doesn't have a number, I mean. Okay. So the left atrium, blood flows through the valves, the bicuspid valve, and then into the left ventricle. And now, so you all told me a couple of things. You said, or I guess I told you, the right side of the heart has what function?
So the right side of the carbon dioxide to the lungs.
Right. So the right side of the heart has the job of pumping the blood, CO2-rich blood, where? To the lungs, and then back to the heart. Okay, so the job is not complete until that oxygen-rich blood gets back to the left atrium. Okay, so now we're here, left atrium, left ventricle. So now what do you think the job of the left side of the heart is? To pump? Pump what type of blood? Oxygen-rich blood to all the body cells, tissues, organs. Okay? And do what at that point? So it drops off oxygen. So the blood is going to drop off the oxygen at whatever tissue it makes it to. And then the blood is going to pick up CO2, right? From where? Huh? Wherever it dropped it off at. That's true. So wherever it drops the oxygen off, it's going to pick up CO2 at that point. Correct. So all the body tissues. Good. Okay, so from the left ventricle? Aortic valve. I was sure it was another valve. Aortic. Aortic valve. Okay. Now, I have to stop again. I just had another thought. The reason, and we mentioned the pulmonary, all the pulmonaries, but what I'm trying to get you all to do is make sense of the path. So you're not just memorizing words in order. Okay, so if you remember, the right side of the heart has the job of sending blood to the lungs. Well, obviously then it makes sense that all those parts are called pulmonary. Pulmonary something, pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins. So notice patterns like that. Also, a common mistake is for students to mix up an artery and a vein. How do you know which side of the lungs you put the veins on? Veins and arteries on, pulmonary vein and artery. So what is an artery? Right. So arteries are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Okay? Arteries are blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. That's the definition of an artery. Don't ever forget that. Definition of a vein. Give me a whole sentence. No, give me a complete sentence. A vein is a blood vessel that carries blood back toward the heart or to the heart. Okay? So, it should make sense then that you would not put pulmonary arteries after the lungs, because blood is going back to what? Back to the heart. So if veins are what carry blood back to the heart, it must be between the lungs and the heart. Okay? So that's the difference between arteries and veins. And now, we don't have pulmonary anything, but we have this A word a couple of times, aortic valve. And then the aorta. The aortic valve in the aorta. And aorta just means large artery. So now we go where? To arteries. And I think this is where you don't see it anymore on the picture. You do see a little bit. You see arteries. So follow on the picture, looking at the picture, follow blood from the left atrium up to the arteries there. So can you visualize the path? Part of the ascending aorta you can't see in the picture is behind the pulmonary trunk. But if you can imagine going back behind there, the blood would flow from the left ventricle upward into the ascending aorta and the aortic arch, and then blood would continue on through other parts of the aorta or through arteries. Okay, so let's just imagine, and I've never done this before, but let's just imagine that we're wanting to follow blood from the right side of the heart to a particular tissue. Let's pick out a body tissue or body region. And let's go to the brain. Let's just say the precentral gyrus. Okay? So from the heart to the precentral gyrus. What does the precentral gyrus do? Why is it important that we get that oxygen to the precentral gyrus? Exactly. So we can have our voluntary ability to move, right? So that's the primary motor cortex. Good job. So now, but we're not quite there yet. And so in order to get to the brain, the precentral gyrus, blood has a particular path that it has to follow. Now, you all don't have to know all the specific arteries, but you do next week, some of them anyway. You'll learn those, but you don't have to know them for the path. But there's many arteries between this point and then that tissue in the brain. But we're going to skip here from the arteries on into the brain tissue, where there are smaller arteries called arterioles. Okay? And now the arterioles feed into what? The capillaries. Okay? And this is where it will be good for you all to see a picture of a capillary. What exactly is a capillary? It's a small, it's considered a blood vessel, right? But it's the tiniest of blood vessels. And even at the lungs, what do we say happens at the lungs? When blood flows into the lungs, it goes through the lungs, and then blood comes out of the lungs. But while it's in the lungs, what are the blood vessels of the organs called? That's where we are here. So the blood vessels of the organ itself are called capillaries. Okay? So blood vessels of the tissues. It's probably better just to say tissues. Okay? Blood vessels of the tissues are the capillaries. So if you can imagine, the left side, the left ventricle, for example, is a pretty large space. So if you're looking at the picture of the handout, you see the ventricle is number 8, and at the top of the picture you'll see arteries, which are 10, number 10 in the path. You all can see this later. But when you get up to the aorta, blood then continues to go up toward the brain through those arteries. But look at the size difference. Look at the amount of blood that the left ventricle would be able to hold compared to the amount of blood that an artery would be able to hold. You see there's a large difference in the size of the left ventricle and one artery at the top of the heart. Okay? So the further we get away from the heart, the blood vessels have to get smaller, narrower, and narrower. Okay? So that's all this is here. So when you see aorta, I told you an aorta is just a very large artery. When you get to the arteries, they have a smaller diameter. And then they feed into even smaller arteries and smaller arteries until you get to the arterioles, which are tiny arteries. Okay? But these are all connected. It's just that the diameter gets smaller and smaller as we move toward the capillaries. Okay? And so the capillaries are going to have an even smaller. So the capillary diameter is so small that only one red blood cell can go through it at a time. We can't even see red blood cells with our eyes, right? So that tells you how small a capillary must be. We can see veins and arteries, and we can actually see the veins that pop up. But our arterioles are tiny. We wouldn't be able to see those. And we definitely wouldn't be able to see capillaries because, again, they're so small that only one red blood cell can go through. And so that's why the vessels have to get smaller and smaller, because how do you match up something this wide with something this small? You can't, so it has to decrease in diameter. All right, so as the red blood cell, now remember we're talking about a red blood cell that is O2 rich, carrying that oxygen. And now the oxygen makes it into the capillaries. Okay, and what are capillaries again? Right, the blood vessels of the tissues. Okay, and now, so now we're at the capillary, and the blood in the capillaries over here has a high oxygen level. Okay, but around the capillaries, these are our body cells. So whatever part of the body this particular capillary is in, and we just said it's in our precentral gyrus. So these are neurons then. Neurons are neuroglial cells that are wrapped around, actually the capillaries wrap around our cells. And now the capillaries has enough oxygen to what? To deliver to the neurons there that are around it. Okay, so the capillaries have the oxygen, and it just is waiting to deliver the oxygen to the brain cells, the brain tissue, or wherever we are in the body. Okay, are y'all following me? Have I lost you? Okay. All right, so what's the second half? So we said gas exchange occurs at the lungs and also at the capillaries. But what is exchanged here? And so the oxygen leaving the blood capillaries goes into the body cell. But now the body cells, before they pick up the oxygen, the cells themselves have carbon dioxide that they have to get rid of. So the CO2 that's in the cells has to come out and enter the capillaries. Okay? So now when the blood leaves the capillaries, it's going to have the CO2 from all of those neurons, okay? All the astrocytes or wherever we are in the tissue. And now the blood just continues on. So again, the capillaries are just small vessels. The blood is always flowing through. So when it flows in, you know that the oxygen is present in the capillaries. But when the blood flows out of the capillaries, it's CO2. Now what you all are going to have to understand later is where CO2 comes from. That's a question I always like to ask. So you know blood is either CO2 rich or oxygen rich.
From the body cells.
Exactly. So when you exhale CO2, you know exactly where that CO2 is coming from. I'll ask you how does oxygen get in the blood and how does CO2 get in the blood? How does oxygen get out of the blood and how does CO2 get out of the blood? Right? So oxygen gets into the blood when the blood flows through the lungs. Okay? So just keep thinking. And the lungs have capillaries too. Okay? Actually, it's the capillaries of the lungs that blood flows through. Okay? So the lung has its own arterioles and capillaries. I just left that off. So all tissues have capillaries. That's the only way that blood can dump off oxygen and CO2. It has to go through capillaries. Okay, the blood vessels of the organ itself. Okay, so oxygen again enters the blood when the blood flows through the lung capillaries. And CO2, how do we get rid of CO2? When blood flows through the lungs, okay? And where do we get rid of oxygen? The capillaries from the tissues, any of the body tissues. And how does CO2 get in the blood? The body cells, right? So all of our body cells have this CO2. Why do they have CO2 if they don't need it? They make it. They produce it as they do their job. That's pretty good. And what job is that? Aerobic respiration. There it is again. So remember, oxygen plus glucose. We're talking about aerobic cell respiration. Remember that? You start with oxygen and glucose, and you end up with what? ATP. That's aerobic cell respiration. But it also So this is what the cell is able to make. This is every cell in our body, right? We already said if a cell can't make ATP, that cell no longer lives. So when all the body cells receive oxygen and glucose, they make ATP, but that process also makes H2O. Did you all know our cells can make water? Yeah, cells make water. And also they make CO2. So H2O the body needs, so we do need this, it's called metabolic water. We don't have to bring it in, the cells make it themselves. And CO2. The CO2 we don't need, or not much of it. So, as much as made has to be delivered to the lungs so we can let it out. So that's why we breathe constantly. In oxygen, out CO2. Okay, so how do we get rid of the CO2? So the cells, these neurons just made CO2 from making ATP. Now they have to get rid of the CO2. They get rid of it where? They dump it into the capillary, right? Right next door. The capillary transports it to, let's go down this way. So this side, so you'll notice in a picture, the colors are different, right? Notice most of the time you'll see arteries as red. Red usually means oxygen rich. And the veins are usually blue. Not always, but usually. And the blue color means CO2 rich or oxygen poor. So when you look at a capillary, if you ever see a capillary, half of the capillary is going to be red, the other half is going to be blue. Because as blood flows through, blood is getting rid of the what? Oxygen. The blood is dropping off oxygen at the tissues, and then by the time the blood reaches the end of the capillary, it has picked up CO2 from the cells. So now it has to try to get rid of the CO2 by delivering it back to the only place we can get rid of CO2. There's only one place, the lungs. So now you have to show me how we get back from my post-central gyrus or pre-central gyrus back to the lungs. How does the blood get from my brain back to the lungs to get rid of the CO2? And one of the things you'll find that is wrong with having too much CO2 is it makes blood acidic. So a lot of times if a person is hyperventilating, they're breathing too rapidly, so they're losing too much CO2. So the blood can become too basic. If there's too much CO2, it can make the blood acidic. And that can happen if you hold your breath for a long time, as long as you can, repeatedly. Your blood can become acidic. Okay. What's the path? So blood leaves the capillaries and goes to the venules, then the veins, and then the vena cava. And you have two, so whenever vena cava ends with an E, that's just plural. That's the superior and inferior. Vena cava. All right, venules, veins, vena cava. So again, these are all veins. Venules are just tiny veins. And veins are medium sized, and the vena cava is the largest vein. Large, very large vein. So just like we did up here, you can draw a large diameter aorta, and it tapers into smaller arteries and into even smaller arterioles. Here we're going in the opposite direction though, so the venules are tiny in diameter, the veins are medium sized, and the vena cava is very large. Okay, does it make sense? Why would the venules be close to the capillaries? I mean, why would it be important for them to be tiny? Because they're close to the capillaries. So since the capillaries are so tiny, you have to measure up something tiny next to it. So on the test, do not put capillaries, veins, venules. It doesn't make sense. right? Now that you know what the words mean. So venules to larger veins to even larger vena cava. And now where do we go?
Back to the right atrium.
All right, we're back where we started. In the big old right atrium. So we're back to the right atrium. All right, we still haven't finished the job, right? So remember the left side of the heart has what job?
Pump air to body cells.
What now?
Putting blood back in the heart.
Give me a complete sentence.
The left side of the heart's job
You said help me out. Why am I the only one talking?
is to get the nutrient blood to the body cells and then,
Yeah, that. Okay. To pump oxygen-rich blood to the body cells and pick up CO2 and
back to the heart.
send that CO2-rich blood back to the right side of the heart. Very good. Back to the right side of the heart. So now the left ventricle hasn't done its job until blood makes it back to the right atrium. The right side of the heart hasn't done its job until blood makes it back to the left atrium. So the two work together in that fashion. All right. And then again, the right atrium, the right side of the heart has the job of sending CO2-rich blood to the lungs, dropping it off, then picking up oxygen,
And take it into the left side of the heart.
taking it to the left side of the heart. All right. So that's the path of blood. Y'all got it? Y'all ready for the quiz? Right now? Who's ready? Is anybody ready? You're not? Okay.
I'm ready to have it. You get issues.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. How could I reward you all for being ready 5 days early? Because I'll do it. Leave the